Join us as we go on an adventure to tell you all about the cards that define CEDH as it is today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Playing with Power podcast, the podcast where we talk about all things CEDH, EDH, and Magic the Gathering. I am your host, Ryan.
And I am your host, Callahan, and today we're going to be starting another series. Over time, whenever we get around to it, we'll be looking back on the cards, sets, and blocks over the last 30 years that have defined CEDH as it was and how it is today. Today, we're going to be starting at the very obvious beginning, which is the sets known as Alpha, Beta, Unlimited, and Revised. But first, before we talk about these very expensive Magic the Gathering cards, we've got to pay the bills. Tickets for our latest Moxmaster tournaments are on sale now. You can compete for up to $2,000 in prizes and points toward the Moxmasters Invitational coming in Columbus, Ohio this October. Tickets sell out for each event, so go to moxmasters.events and sign up for the upcoming tournament today. We also now have merchandise available in our store. We have dice, coins, playmats, tokens, sleeves, and more all available. I don't want to spill the beans, but we're maybe working on something new right now too. Go to playingwithpowermtg.com and help support the channel. You can also support us on Patreon. Our Patrons get access to our Discord, webcam league, playdays, early access to videos, names in the credits of our show, exclusive videos, merchandise, and even the ability to be on an episode. There are tiers available for everyone, and it is the best way to support us. So go to patreon.com/playingwithpowermtg today if you would love to help support our show. Also, if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, reach out to Ryan's email below.
Also, we do a Patreon shout out in every single episode, and today's Patreon shout out goes to Ryan Gore. Nice name, Ryan.
Thank you.
Nice name.
Thank you, Ryan Gore. So this series that we're starting, what is our idea with it? Well, it's, as I'm sure you're aware, it is currently the 30th year anniversary of Magic the Gathering, started all the way back in 1993. And that does have us feeling a little bit nostalgic. And we were thinking, of all of the formats that are out there, CEDH might be very uniquely positioned together with, Commander itself, in that it uniquely draws on cards from all over the 30-year history of Magic the Gathering. We play so many different cards across so many different decks that we have a shocking amount of staples from throughout that entire 30-year history. So we figured that from time to time, we'll release a new episode in this series. And on every episode, we'll be taking a look back at the history of these sets. We're going to highlight several sets at a time. Like we said, today we're looking at Alpha, Beta, Unlimited, and Revised. We're going to probably give you a few factoids about those sets real quick. And then we're going to talk about how those sets and the cards from those sets have impacted CEDH, either now or in the ancient past, which is to say like 2015. Some sets will have a lot to offer to CEDH. Some will have none. Not really looking forward to Homelands, for example. But let me tell you, Alpha, Beta, Unlimited, and Revised, we've got a lot of cards to talk about today. But Ryan, give us a little background on ABUR, as many people call it first.
Yep, Alpha, Beta, Unlimited, and Revised, otherwise known as ABUR for the rest of this episode, because that's a big mouthful of words.
It's a lot of words. Yeah.
So ABUR is the very first sets that were released in Magic's history. So we're going to start off with Alpha. So Alpha was the very first set that was ever released, designed by Richard Garfield and a number of other people. It was released in 295 black bordered cards, released August 5th, 1993.
At
Alpha,
Gen Con.
Yeah. So Alpha was pretty sloppy in terms of mistakes and issues with the printing. You'll find all kinds of errors that were only really in Alpha. Another thing that was very unique about Alpha was that it did not have as rounded of corners in its actual printing process, the actual stamping process of the cards. So a lot of those cards are considered marked by today's standards. So unless you had like an all Alpha deck way back when you first started playing Magic, those cards were considered marked because we didn't have sleeves back then. So Pro Tour's literally like playing sleeveless. They were all monsters back then, but here we are. So that was something that was very unique to Alpha. But like there was plenty of things that were also pretty like really sloppy and mistakes were made when it just comes to certain things. But also Alpha was when they defined the mechanics and when they actually made this game and they actually released it to the world. They said, hey, here's the game. Do you like it? And yeah, we sure do. We sure do like it. It was really, really wild. So some of the most powerful cards ever printed were printed here. And that's just because they didn't quite know what they were doing at the time. They're like, here's a card. I think it might be good. It's called a Black Lotus. You get 3, but it's only in one shot. You only get it once. You'd be like, no, that's really, really powerful. So it was a brand new game and they didn't quite know what they were doing yet. I mean, some people could argue that they still don't, but that's another conversation altogether.
Wow.
But, I'm not here to judge. I'm just here to play the game. They also knew there would be huge power outliers, but they figured that an entire play group might have one of them, but didn't envision how much people would be into the game. So when they first released this set, it was just like, here's a set, do some stuff with it. And that's where things like the Channel Fireball combo came from, because everyone would just pack their deck full of 10 Black Lotuses. And they think, we'll just scatter the printings far and wide so people wouldn't have access to them, but they didn't realize that people would actually go and gather these cards. And so Alpha was the start, the very, very start of Magic. And there are cards that were printed at Alpha that see Commander play, that see CEDH play to this very day. Moving on to Beta. So we have 302 black bordered cards that was released October 4th, 1993. Alpha was released August 5th. Beta was released October 4th. That's because Alpha sold out. Okay.
Immediately. Pretty much at the event. Yeah. Pretty much at Gen Con.
Yeah. It sold out immediately because it was that good. So they knew they had something on their hands. So they had to go and they had to release Beta. Now, Beta was 302 black bordered cards, but they didn't print anything new. That's the thing. There weren't new cards printed, but they wanted to get to that 300 threshold. Over 300 cards, unique cards, 300 cards in the set. So what they did was they actually put extra lands on the print sheet to say that they're. So they actually just made new basic lands and put them on the print sheet. So they increased the size by adding basic lands to new art, and they also filled in 2 missing cycles. There was the Circle of Protection cycle. They actually forgot to print black. So there was circle of protection, white and green and stuff like that, but black wasn't in Alpha. The other one, which was a little bit more notable, was Volcanic Island, one of the original dual lands. They forgot to print that in Alpha. So if anybody ever tries to give you a joke and say, I've got an Alpha Volcanic Island, that's the joke. It's because one doesn't exist in Alpha, which is pretty wild. So like I said, it fixed a number of the mistakes in Alpha's printing, but still left a number of other mistakes too. So which is kind of funny. But so they said, okay, there is something here. We're going to print more cards and we're going to put them out there. So the next one was Unlimited, and this one was white bordered cards this time. So the first 2 were black bordered. Alpha had the not as rounded corners. Beta was still black bordered. Unlimited was the white bordered set. It had 40 million cards printed. Alpha only had 2.6 million, sold out immediately. 7.8 million were printed in Beta, and that one sold out.
Also pretty much sold out immediately.
Yep. Yeah. Unlimited was released December 1st, 1993. So in the span of like 4 or 5 months, they printed 3 sets, and this was all in 93. August 5th for Alpha, October 4th for Beta, and December 1st for Unlimited. They saw they had something. They saw that there was something there immediately. Then in April 1994, they printed Revised. Now, this is 306 white bordered cards released in April 1994. 500 million cards were printed in Revised versus all the others. So if you wonder why your dual lands are a couple $100 in Revised, but they're like $1,000 in the others, that's why. There's about maybe 15,000 of a dual land in Unlimited, but 150,000. These are just guess numbers, of course, like in Revised. This was the first set that actually rotated things out. So all Alpha, Beta, and Unlimited, they printed the same cards 3 times. They just printed them with a different border treatment, whether it be black or white or rounded or whatever. And they fixed some mistakes. But like Revised was the first one that actually rotated out cards, said, hey, there was some power level things that we're discovering very quickly. There are certain cards here that are a little bit more powerful than we thought they would be, so we're going to rotate them out. And then there were also cards that were added. Now, the cards that were added in Revise were cards that came out from the expansions that happened in between Unlimited and Revised coming out. Now, that's not something we're going to go into today, but there was a couple of sets that were released, like Arabian Nights and stuff like that they actually took some cards from those sets and printed them into the Revised sets while taking other ones out. Yeah, all in all, 30-ish cards were kind of swapped, for lack of a better word. So that is the history of ABUR.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Mm-hmm. That is the early history of Magic the Gathering is so fascinating to me because like they knew they had something on their hands, but they like didn't really realize how much of a thing they had on their hands. They're like, wow, we sold out everything in Alpha, which we thought was going to be like a several month supply. So we're going to print based on like how we thought Alpha did at this event. We're going to print a several month supply of Beta. And then it sold out basically instantly. And then they finally kind of got it right with Unlimited, kind of. Because Unlimited still sold out pretty fast. It was really hard to get. It's actually really hard to get a hold of a Magic cards on the central and eastern half of the United States for a very long time. Because, you know, Wizards of the Coast have pretty much always been out on the West Coast. And, you know, how they got it in game stores originally was like, they would drive down the West Coast and be like, here are these cards that we have. Would you like to buy these cards? And the stores were like, yeah. Which was like, that was like what they did with Beta. They got Beta in and then they just like drove down the coast. They just drove down the coast and they're like, here are these boxes of Beta, guys. Yeah. So it took a while for cards to kind of travel east across the United States, which is kind of has always been wild to me.
Yeah, and there's so much that we could talk about with these sets. Yeah, we could go on for hours and hours and hours about all the nuance and all the little idiosyncrasies and all the little things and little details about these sets because, I mean, they're such a tentpole in Magic's history. They're the first. And as we go through some of these cards today, you're going to realize that some of these cards they originally printed, we still play today.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, and so we're not going to dive any further in because we could absolutely devote an entire series just to the history itself. But what we want to talk about is how
if you want more of that, go listen to the Receivables podcast with Cedric Phillips and Patrick Sullivan. That's what they're doing. We're not doing that.
Exactly. And they're going to do it probably far better than we will. But we do want to talk about those cards that were printed and their impact, specifically on CEDH, but just in the greater Magic, Commander, all that kind of game, over the years.
Yep. So we wanted to start off with the number one card, the CEDH card. Well, that's Mana Crypt, but the CEDH card, the EDH card. It's Sol Ring. Yeah. Did you know that Sol Ring was an Alpha, Beta, Unlimited, Revised, etc.? They said, you know how Mana Rock should work? You should pay 1 mana and you should get 2 mana back for your troubles. Sol Ring. I mean, I don't have a lot to say about Sol Ring beyond I could not imagine a card that has had any more significant impact on like the history and trajectory of Commander. I know there's a lot of people that are like, what if we banned Sol Ring? I think that would be an interesting concept. However, I agree with what several people much smarter than me have said, which like if Sol Ring wasn't legal in Commander, Commander might have never actually seen the success that it sees today. So much of like Commander's success is wrapped up in like, the big Timmy dreams of I'm going to play all my big spells, all my cool stuff that I really like. And Sol Ring just like makes that a lot less painful,
Mm-hmm.
You can pay 1 mana, get 2 mana back. That makes casting your big spells all a lot easier. But we're talking about CEDH here. I mean, Sol Ring, the second or third best mana rock in pretty much every single CEDH deck, right? Depending on the deck, Jeweled Lotus, they might like a little bit more, but Sol Ring is about as good as it gets. It doesn't cost 0, obviously, but Sol Ring gives you so much return on investment for 1 mana. Immediately pays itself back. Exponentially pays itself back over the next several turns. Sol Ring, great for casting your turn 1 Rhystic Study. But I mean, what else could you need out of a Magic the Gathering card, Ryan? It's crazy to me that Sol Ring was just here. I could not imagine how expensive Sol Ring would be if it hadn't been reprinted like 4 times a year for the last decade. And it's still like $3.
Mm-hmm. That's the thing. It gets printed what? It's one of the most reprinted cards other than like basic lands. Like it's printed 12 times a year. Like every Commander product, every single one has a Soul Ring. And it's still like a $3 card. Back before they started printing Soul Ring into the ground constantly because they had to.
My bad. It's $1.50 now.
Oh, whoa, wow. They're really messing with the prices. Whoa. Bump the brakes there, Wizards. You don't know what you're doing to the secondhand market. But Soul Ring was climbing up to $30 back in like 28, right before the Commander products were printed, the first Commander products in 2011. Soul Ring is frequently in the top 5 most powerful cards of all time. It's up there. People talk about, hey, some of the most powerful, most broken cards we've ever seen printed throughout all the years of Magic. Soul Ring's always on that list. Even, some people will deliberate this and that and the other, but it is frequently cited as one of the most powerful. You get to jump 2 turns. So your turn 1 turns into turn 4. And that is fascinating. It's so broken. And it's so ubiquitous in Commander that we forget just how powerful it is because you see it all the time. So it becomes very normalized. How unbelievably broken Soul Ring is just shows you how unbelievably crazy that this format is. And Commander / CEDH, I agree, probably wouldn't be what it is today if it wasn't for the fact that Soul Ring kind of became its centerpiece. Hey, you can play really, really busted stuff. Maybe not the really, really expensive busted stuff for the sake of accessibility into this format we're building, but you could play Soul Ring. And they're like, wow, that's crazy. We can really play that card? That's amazing. And the rest is history. We see Soul Ring so much now that everyone's probably like, that's not that bad a card. That's how crazy this format is when you say that Soul Ring isn't that bad of a card. It's wild.
Yep, exactly. Soul Ring, could not really imagine something that has defined the trajectory of EDH or CEDH more, all the way back from the very beginning of history.
Very beginning. Alpha. It was printed in Alpha.
Exactly. And up next, another really good mana rock. This one, for whatever reason, they decided to make a little bit worse than Soul Ring in the same set. But I guess that's a pretty big theme in ABUR. Stuff's all over the place.
It is.
That is Mana Vault. Pay a single colorless, tap it, and get 3 colorless. It doesn't untap on your untap step, but you can pay 4 during your untap step to untap it if you want. And then on your draw step, if it is still tapped, you will take a singular damage. Mana Vault, I guess I kind of joked about it being worse, and it is, but it's still just like simply one of the best mana rocks ever printed still, because the ability to jump from 1 mana to 3 mana is simply incredibly strong. Granted, it's colorless mana. It's no Black Lotus, right? But luckily that isn't legal in CEDH. Mana Vault is yet another. We're finally at this point in CEDH's history. We're 30 years removed from the very beginning of Magic the Gathering sets. There are 6 figures of Magic cards. And just now we're kind of getting to the point where some CEDH decks maybe don't play Mana Vault anymore. Mana Vault, it is kind of a little bit awkward because it creates all colorless mana, right? And as we get towards playing more and more efficient spells, colorless mana is actually like a little bit more like worthless, quote unquote, or its value goes down as our spells get better and better because our spells are cheaper and cost less generic mana. But we're like finally just getting to this point now, kind of like 7 or 8 years into kind of like the developed history of CEDH and 30 years into the history of the game, we're kind of getting to this point where maybe we don't always want to play Mana Vault, but that's crazy. It's been years and years. This card is just so good. It's been a staple for as long as we've been playing CEDH. It is very, very slowly being shown the door now, and not in some decks, it's still just like must play, but Mana Vault, probably like the 4th most impactful artifact in CEDH history. I don't know.
It's definitely up there. Mana Vault is pretty crazy because I agree. It got jammed into a lot of things. But as you said, colorless is kind of worthless. We know it's not worthless. It's just so easy to generate infinite colorless that it loses some of its value. Thrasios decks being able to generate infinite colorless, Kinnan decks being able to generate infinite colorless. It's so simple to do that nowadays with all the history of it. Mana Vault is starting to get relegated to the ones that when you want to power out a very, very specific spell. So Ad Nauseam decks will want to do it because they need that 3 colorless to quickly pump out an Ad Naus. Crom decks will want it to power out their commander early. But beyond that, you're not really seeing like this one spell with an X in it might benefit from 3 colorless. No, they don't actually put Mana Vault in there for that particular thing anymore. It's only if you have access to the command zone or you're constantly trying to get access to a very, very, very specific spell are you really running Mana Vault. That's not to say Mana Vault's not powerful, because it absolutely is. Its $100 price tag as of the time of this recording definitely reflects that. It's absolutely insane. There's not really much else to say, like you said. It's a fantastic card, and it was printed in alpha with very confusing text. The text on it is absolutely bananas, and to this day, people still get it confused. They're like, oh, it's my upkeep. I'll take a damage for my Mana Vault. Technically,
no.
Yep.
Draw step.
You take it in your draw step, technically. That's very important for those Necropotence players out there who skip their draw step. They don't take a damage from their Mana Vault.
What a funny little interaction.
It's so wild. Oh, this is great combos. Anyway, so yeah, Mana Vault, so good.
Well, up next on our list, we have a white card. Actually, the only white card on our list today. This tells you about CEDH before 2018, really. And that is probably the best removal spell printed in the history of the game. Mm-hmm. I would go so far as to say.
It is.
And that is Swords to Plowshares, white instant, a single white instant, exile target creature. Its controller gains life equal to its power. Swords is the penultimate flexible removal spell. And in return, it gives your opponents probably the least valuable resource that it could give them. I think Swords is really interesting because a lot of people, especially when they're newer to the game of Magic, are like, oh, I give my opponent life? I would never want to do that. That means I'm losing the game because they're gaining more life than me. But no, especially when it comes to CEDH, we already have plenty of life laying around. Sure, it's a little more dangerous if your opponent is on an Ad Naus deck. We always attack the Ad Naus player for a reason. But Swords to Plowshares as unconditional creature removal, which exiles, which is also additionally relevant depending on the deck. It has just always been playable in your white decks. I would not want to think about a future where Swords is not playable in your white decks, either because people have tricked themselves into not playing that removal or because we somehow have a better removal spell for that slot. Swords, it's great. Play it. Crazy to me that we simply got the best white removal spell in the very first set. And it says, like, removed from the game entirely. That's what it says on alpha. Removed from the game entirely. Actually uses the word entirely. Like, you don't even get to put it in the graveyard. You need to throw it in the garbage. It's like it was very, very ominous. Like, you need to no, you don't. Exile zones didn't exist back then. The idea of exiling, you always remove things from the game. But then when they printed Wishes and later sets, they're like, well, that's technically removed from the game and that's outside the game. Does that technically exist? And they had to go through a bunch of things. And they're like, all right, we need to figure out what that zone is. Entirely is what they say. And it's a really cool card because, like you said, it's one white. It's an instant. And it's an instant in a time when interrupts existed. So interrupts were basically, you're saying, I'm going to interrupt what you're doing on your turn and do something like cast counter magic or interaction. And then when interacts are on the stack, only other interacts can ever be used on it. I'm sorry, interrupts. Whenever interrupts were on the stack, only other interrupts could be used. That's the old school rules. Now everything is just an instant. But let's talk about batching.
Yeah. And so Swords to Plowshares is in my opinion, and comment below about which card is more powerful than Swords to Plowshares as removal, and I will tell you you're wrong. Because it's the most powerful. There is no equal. There are some that come close, but there is no equal. Unconditional, any creature removed from the game entirely, and it's one white. It is such a power. If your deck runs white, you don't start with 99 cards, you start with 98. Technically, you start with 97 because Soul Ring's in there, but Swords to Plowshares is the number one card you put. Speaking of multiple printings in Soul Ring, Swords to Plowshares has been printed like 60 times throughout the years of Magic's history, and it's still $2-3 if that says anything about it. So.
Yep. Kind of always a must-have. Cross-format applicable. If you can play it, you probably play it. I don't think they play it in Vintage, but they don't play Creatures in Vintage. Creatures are fake. Moving on, we have a card that was, I think, quite impactful on some of the earlier history of CEDH and has definitely fallen off the map a little bit now, but is also simply one of the most iconic cards in Magic the Gathering history. Counterspell. It is a card so ubiquitous in its effect that it's what we call all things that share its effect now. Counterspell, blue, counter target spell. Counterspell really sent us down the path of control existing as an archetype. It gave us it gave Wizards the roadmap for all of these awesome effects that kind of define how we play CEDH now. Counterspell these days, if players want to play blue for a counterspell these days, they're usually just going to play Mana Drain, since Mana Drain is kind of obviously strictly better counterspell. Yeah. Now that we don't have Mana Burn to contend with anymore. But a counterspell, it's kind of fallen by the wayside. A deck or two out there plays it. I don't know if Curious Control plays it. I imagine if any deck plays Counterspell, it would play Curious Control, but they have a lot better options these days to mess around with. A lot more 1 CMC counters, a lot more blue and a colorless counters to use these days. But Counterspell, it was very good for the first few years of CEDH when we had a lot less of those options. We didn't have miscast to cut from our deck, so we didn't have an offer you can't refuse, and we had delay, but we weren't sure if it was great, and all this kind of stuff. Counterspell was an easy thing to rely on, and its obvious effect has been giving Wizards it gave Wizards the blueprint for so many more counterspells that we use today.
Counterspell is where countering spells got their name. Counterspell, one word, counters target spell. All counter magic owes its allegiance to this card. It was one of the few counter magic control-ish type cards that were printed back in the ABUR sets. There was a few of them, but entire decks were made on them, and Counterspell was the cornerstone of it. There isn't really a whole lot to say. Mana Drain did used to strictly be worse. Like you countered someone's Shivan Dragon, and then you couldn't use the colorless mana in the main phase. You got Mana Burn. So that was the downside of Mana Drain. But now we don't have that, so it's just a strict upgrade now. Usually low color decks, low color blue decks still want to run Counterspell. I mean, it's unconditional counter of any kind. I don't care what you're casting, a breach, a creature, a whatever. You can counter it with this spell. Now, like you said, some of the higher color decks, the 4 and 5 color decks, they have a tough time getting blue pips early and consistently, and they want more flexibility, so they use this in favor of other things, and it usually gets the job done. But Counterspell is, the best counter that has been around because it's at its cost for what it does. It is one of the most powerful counter spells. Just the 2 blue pips is usually what gets CDH off of it, but CDH ran it for years.
Yep. Speaking of a card that CEDH has run for years, and once again, will probably simply never stop playing all the way back in Alpha, we have the card that got Magic the Gathering in a lot of hot water with a lot of confirmed bombs. It's Demonic Tutor. Featuring a pentagram-laden devil on its original art.
Yep.
Demonic Tutor. A black, a colorless sorcery. Put any card you want out of your library directly into your hand. It doesn't get more efficient than this. Ryan and I, on a few different podcasts recently, depending on the topic, end up talking about Demonic Tutor because, well, it's just probably one of the best black cards. It's one of the best cards you can be playing, period. Because 2 mana to get whatever card you need is pretty dang good when we're out here playing 100 card singleton. For as long as I've been playing CEDH, it's been a staple. I imagine for the rest of history, it'll simply be a staple. People like playing it in normal EDH. People like playing it in other formats sometimes when they can. So, hey, I don't have anything else to say about Demonic Tutor.
Most powerful tutor in the game. We could talk about, things like Vampiric Tutor being pretty good, but it is a top of the library tutor. This one's directly into your hand and all this other stuff. And it was printed all the way back in Alpha. It was, they didn't quite know exactly how to deal with, like what power of certain things were. They're like, yeah, any card. Let's two sounds good, but it's a sorcery, so it's slow. It's fine. It's fine. Yeah, that was still really powerful. 2 mana, find any card, then execute whatever you're trying to execute. Like you said, there was a lot of satanic panic back in the early 90s, and a lot of very concerned parents were worried about what the cards their kids were playing on the kitchen table after school. And they hear their kids say, "I cast Demonic Tutor."
Ah!
And they're like, "What's going on?" And they
run over there. There's a pentagram on
and
it.
there's
Ah!
and there's literally a pentagram on his head and chest. And parents got really concerned. That's interestingly has to do with the story of Summer Magic, or Edgar. Summer Magic and Edgar was a result or a kind of response to Revise's printing. If you have any revised cards, you'll notice that a lot of the colors are really washed out. And like you said, the satanic panic really started to take a foothold around then. And they're like, well, let's do some stuff to fix that. And one of the things they did in the Summer Magic or Edgar printing of Revised was remove the pentagram from the demon's head, his forehead. Ironically, they didn't remove it from his chest. They forgot that part, but however, Edgar actually ended up having its own problems, and what they ended up doing was they ended up destroying it. However, about 40 cases were rumored to get out. So if you live in like Ireland, Kentucky, and like one other state or something like that, I know Ireland's not a state, so stop trying to correct me in the comments. But like in those 3 areas, there is like a swath of Summer Magic / Edgar out there. So if you find any card that looks like it's from ABUR and it has 1994 in the printing, oh my God, keep a hold of that card. That card is worth so much money. The Blue Hurricanes came from that. And those of you who don't know the Blue Hurricanes, that's basically another misprinting is one of the reasons why they destroyed Edgar. There's a whole big thing on Edgar. We'll put a link in the show notes about Edgar. It's a really interesting story. I highly recommend you guys go watch it. But Demonic Tutor is one of the reasons that Edgar was printed. And yeah, fantastic, powerful card. Still used very ubiquitously in all black decks today.
Yep. And kind of coming up on some cards that now are kind of almost in the same boat as Counterspell. Some decks still play them. Every deck used to play them. And now they're kind of becoming a little hit or miss depending on your philosophy or what your deck is trying to do. And that is Mana Dorks as a whole. But Alpha, Beta, Unlimited, Revised brought us our very first 2 ever Mana Dorks. There's Llanowar Elf, pay a green, get a 1/1 elf that'll tap for a green. And then there is, of course, also Birds of Paradise, green, 0/1 flying, tap for 1 mana of any color. One of my favorite little ABUR stories is that Birds of Paradise was kind of just like a throw-in towards the end of design, because they got art for Tropical Island that actually just kind of like focused more on a bird instead of the tropical island itself. And they didn't want to use it for Tropical Island. So they were like, what if we made a card about a tropical bird? And a Birds of Paradise was born. That's what I remember the story being. My apologies if I just completely pulled that out of a hat. But if that's true, if my memory is correct, they simply created the best mana dork of all time. Just pay a green, get any mana color back you want. Llanowar Elves also in the set. It's iconic for a reason. Paying green to get some green in the future has always been pretty good if your deck contains green. And as in CEDH historically, people have loved playing both Llanowar Elves and Birds of Paradise. As I said up top, Llanowar Elves, especially like Llanowar Elves and all of its ilk, like Elvish Mystic and Fyndhorn Elves and whatnot, are falling off the map a little bit. Green decks in general are getting less and less popular. The green decks, the decks that do play green, are playing like less and less green spells, as they're replaced with spells of like higher quality from other colors, because green has gotten less and less must-play CDH staples over the years. And as a result, since CDH decks are in such need of like those colored pips, we kind of have just cared less and less about that green pip that the Elvish army are providing for us. So Llanowar Elves you don't see as much any day, or its related cards. But Birds of Paradise, hey, I love getting a mana of any color. If there's any knock on Birds of Paradise compared to like all the artifacts and stuff that we play, it is that you have to wait a turn cycle to use it. thanks to good old summoning sickness. But Birds of Paradise still in really big demand today, and mana dorks in general, which these two kind of like counterspells set the table for all counterspells to follow. Birds of Paradise and Llanowar Elves, though they're probably like Birds of Paradise is obviously the best dork that's ever printed. Llanowar Elves is pretty much like the ceiling of non-Birds of Paradise mana dorks that we ever saw. They still kind of set the table for a future of like more and more mana dorks, which CEDH used to love greatly.
And it just fell off because it was just a little too slow. And like you said, green gets great tools for Commander every day. Every set has a great green bomb for all of the Timmies out there to play in Casual Commander, and that's great. Just CDH doesn't get a whole lot of really great utility green, and it's just relegated itself to more of the edges of what you use. You know, Dorks became too slow in favor of rocks. And but these were the concept of a mana dork was defined all the way back in alpha. You are correct, by the way, about the Birds of Paradise. It was called it's called top-down design. So, yeah, that's
what I thought. Those jumping around in my head.
Yep.
And I was like, did I make this up?
Nope, you didn't. You got the nail right on the head. They basically had the art, and they're like, what are we going to do with this leftover art? I don't know. Make a card. It's a bird.
Let's make a bird.
It looks like a bird. It's a Bird of Paradise. Great. Yeah. And that's
what does a Bird of Paradise do? It's colorful. It makes all the colors.
And literally, I mean, that was it. It was they took the art, made a card based on art. It was top-down design.
Yep.
And other than when it eventually rotated out, there was a time when Birds of Paradise was always legal in Magic.
For a very long time.
In Magic. It was always legal in Magic with one exception, and that was before the set, I forget the expansion, the core set, but there was like a 2-month period when Birds of Paradise wasn't legal, and then it got printed into Ravnica. And I think that was 7th or 8th edition. Actually, it was 8th edition. So 8th edition, like 7th edition, like rolled out and 8th edition hadn't come out or something like that. And then there was like a 2-month period when Birds of Paradise wasn't legal. But up until that point, Birds of Paradise had always been legal. You could always run Birds of Paradise, which means there was always a green something deck, usually floating around your local game store or floating around the Pro Tours and stuff like that. And Birds of Paradise was a cornerstone of those decks. Birds of Paradise is still seen in green decks today because you can neoform it into something really great like a Dockside.
Yeah, exactly. All of these cards are just kind of awesome. I love looking back at these old cards. It's crazy how many of them we still play. Speaking of an old card that kind of also has fallen out of favor, but used to be played a lot. There's Wild Growth. Wild Growth, it kind of in the same boat as Llanowar Elves, with the upside that you do get to like use it immediately. Pay a green, enchant a land. That land makes an additional green when you tap it for mana. It's kind of like a Llanowar Elf, except that like it's actually kind of harder to destroy because people don't really play land destruction, and not many people are going to use enchantment removal on a Wild Growth. So we just wanted to mention Wild Growth really fast. It is also in this original set. Unlike Llanowar Elves, there's not that many more of these. I guess they've been doing a lot more of these kind of like land enchantments more recently. There's a lot of it's kind of become like a consistent uncommon in a set, like pay 3, enchant a land, it taps for double green or 2 of a color, and then it can like sacrifice the enchantment to do set mechanic.
Yeah, it's really great
something
for
like that.
It's really great for drafting. Fix your mana with a card, and it's
yes, exactly. But Wild Growth, while it has not had many things spring from it, Wild Growth used to be quite the powerhouse in CEDH decks. A lot of people were picking it up to go with their Llanowar Elves and whatnot to help activate their Thrasioses and to help power out other stuff a little bit ahead of schedule. But much like Llanowar Elf, for many of the same reasons why Llanowar Elf and Elvish Mystic and whatnot has fallen off, Wild Growth has kind of fallen off for the same reason. It's a little bit slow. Decks have less and less of a need for green mana in specific. You will see Wild Growth in a lot of like 2 or maybe even 3 color green decks sometimes, depending on the 3 color green deck. But much like many of the mana elf, many of the mana dorks, we used to play them a lot. Now not so much.
I mean, it's 1 green ramp, and it's really hard to find another 1 green ramp out there that isn't a dork. So it definitely still sees play. It doesn't see as much as it used to, but it is very powerful ramp. quite frankly, because we don't destroy lands in this format. We just let them sit around because we don't want to waste our resources when the game can just be over at any moment. So it's still very powerful. And low color decks, like you said, do still run it. It's a good card, and it's not as weak to certain types of removal like Land of War Elves and other things are. And you can use them immediately depending on what turn you're playing them.
Well, we're about halfway through our cards that we have today, so we're going to take a quick ad break, and then we'll be right back to discussing Alpha, Beta, Unlimited, and Revised.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Card Conduit. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. Don't waste hours trying to find the best buy list price for your cards online. Simply send them to Card Conduit and let them take care of the rest. I've used Card Conduit multiple times already. I always use them to get the best value of my extra cards. I get fair prices for my cards and they save me tons of time. They have 3 main services. Their standard service lets you send them unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best buy list price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half of the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their new sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. They give you the best price for your cards. They work with competitive buy listing partners, including ones not open to the public. Users get an average of 19% more for their collection than they would have from a major retail buy list, even with Card Conduit's fees. Card Conduit also optimizes buy listing for card condition as well. Since vendors have different penalties for wear and tear, Card Conduit will find the best buy list price against the specific condition of a card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the show notes or the description, or use the promo code POWER, you'll also get 10% off their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's podcast.
All right, we are back, and now we're going to jump right into the next card that we're going to be talking about in the ABUR cycle for this episode. And we're actually, when we say cycle, we're actually going to go in a little bit into what is known as the Boon Cycle. For this one, we're going to be talking about Dark Ritual and Lightning Bolt. Boon Cycles are the ones that have 1 mana pip that gives you 3 of something. Lightning Bolt, 1 red, deals 3 damage. Dark Ritual, 1 black, create 3 black. Then you have Healing Salve, 1 white, gain 3 life. Watch out. Giant Growth, 1 green. Target creature gets +3/+3, and then of course,
what's that blue one do? Is it okay?
It's not great. It's not great. It's Ancestral Recall. 1 blue, draw 3 cards. It was the
unfortunately that one's banned.
Yeah, that one would have seen absolutely a million. Everyone would play that card. It's crazy, but that one's not legal. It was actually also the only rare in the Boon Cycle, by the way.
Huh.
But the ones that do see play to this day are Dark Ritual and Lightning Bolt. They were printed all the way back in Alpha as part of a cycle, and we still see play of these things. They're that powerful to this day. Dark Ritual is banned in a number of formats due to its power. Obviously, Ancestral Recall is banned for a number of its power, and Healing Salve should be banned for being so horrible that no one ever would play. That's such a horrible card.
It was banned out of the gate.
Yeah. Obviously, they didn't know what they were doing back then. White, gain 3 life. How powerful. Ooh, it negates your Lightning Bolt. But, Lightning Bolt warps entire formats around it whenever it's legal. So when it was reprinted into 10th edition and into Modern, the entire format warped around it. Modern was when they had Modern and Lightning Bolt was legal in it, they actually had to think about how they printed cards and what they did with cards. And one of the things they considered was not having Lightning Bolt in Modern, because of how powerful Lightning Bolt is. Dark Ritual is very similar. It's powers ad nauseums. It powers out commanders. It's such a powerful card. It's also one of the few cards to go through as many different types that there are out there. Started as I believe an instant or an interrupt, became a mana source, and then settled on an instant where it is today. So that's what Dark Ritual did. Pretty sure it started. I think it started as an interrupt. Let's make sure. Yep, it's an interrupt. So it started as an interrupt way back in Alpha, became a mana source as of Mirage because they were still trying to figure out mechanics, and then it settled on an instant where it is today.
Mana sources and interrupts. What a weird time in Magic the Gathering's history, let me say. But yeah, Dark Ritual, Lightning Bolt. Lightning Bolt maybe also kind of fallen in a little bit into that bucket where people aren't sure if they should be playing it or not anymore in CEDH. I personally like it a lot. You're never really going to go to the dome with Lightning Bolt unless you sometimes maybe you'll live the dream of like hitting somebody who went down to 2 on their ad nauseum and somehow they have no counter spells in hand and you hit them for 3 with Lightning Bolt and they die and lose the game. But Lightning Bolt, it removes a lot of the most impactful creatures in the format. It kills a lot of the cheap commanders that people like to play, like Malcolm and Najila. Unfortunately, it does miss Winota, but it does kill Drain of Magistrate. It kills Magus of the Moon. If somebody's trying to loop a Dockside, it'll kill their Dockside. All of that kind of stuff. It can remove a lot of the most impactful creatures in the format. So if you're looking for like a little extra removal spell and you happen to be playing a red deck, in my experience, red decks are not actually hurting for red mana. So it can be a great spell to kind of slip into a turn without having like much implication on what spells you're also able to cast from your hand. And then there's Dark Ritual. Dark Ritual is, to this day, a CDH all-star. If anything, I think its stock has grown over the last several years, which is not actually really something I think we can say for a lot of other cards on this list. Over time, Dark Ritual has only seeming to be getting like better and better, played more and more, and be more and more impactful in its games. Even if you're kind of just using it almost like as a pseudo like mana vault, right? Pay 1 mana to get 3 mana back and then like cast a spell or 2, even if you're like not powering out an ad nauseum with it, right? Paying a mana to make 3 black mana is a lot better than paying a mana to make 3 colorless mana as a one-time like one-shot effect. There's a lot of powerful black spells out there. Dark Ritual, I mean, it's incredible. Going from 1 to 3 mana is about the strongest thing that you can be doing in the format as far as mana goes. And Dark Ritual does it every single time for you.
And enables so many broken things. We don't have to go much farther than that, but think about it. How many times do people be like, I'm going to crack a fetch, and your response is, we only say that because somebody's holding up 1, because somebody could Dark Ritual flash in an opposition agent. It's Dark Ritual that enables that to happen, where everyone has to now say any response to my fetch. Whereas before they would just go crack it and go get their land. But now opposition agent exists, and it is further enabled by Dark Ritual. So absolutely super powerful card. All right. The next one on our list is a very, very interesting one. It is Animate Dead. It is 1 and a black for an aura that has a billion lines of text on it because it is so unbelievably complicated. Basically, the long short of it is that this is an aura that allows you to pull a creature from your graveyard, put it into the battlefield. So basically, it's a 2 mana reanimate effect, and with the super big downside of getting -1/-0. So its power is a little nerfed from it, but it is so powerful. Combos are enabled because of this. You can power out devastating creatures because of this thing, like Razakath, the Foul-Blooded, Villas, Broker of Blood, all those big, powerful demons that allow you to draw a ton of cards and win the game, or tutor a bunch and win the game. A lot of them are facilitated through something like Animate Dead. Animate Dead isn't just that. It also enables the World Gorger Dragon combo, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we talk about Judgment later in this series. But, Animate Dead actually has a whole lot of, had a lot of confusion around it. The alpha printing of Animate Dead actually says Animate Dead Creature. Okay. So what's the big deal of that? Well, what defines a dead creature? Did something have to hit the battlefield, then hit the graveyard? What if it was milled? Is it technically alive and then dead, or never alive to begin with? People were actually confused by the fact that it actually said enchant dead creature. And I thought that was always a very interesting part about Animate Dead. But super powerful, really great card, and it still sees play in a lot of Reanimator type decks to this day.
Yep. At this point, Animate Dead is probably like the second best reanimation spell that we have available to us after Reanimate itself. Yeah. And even Reanimate itself can be a little sketchy if you're lower on life, since it deals so much damage to you because you're reanimating Razakath and taking 8 damage. Ouchie. But Animate Dead, yeah, like Ryan said, it's always been good in Reanimator lists. It's going to stay good in Reanimator lists. Anyone who's trying to do World Gorger loops or Abdel Adrian loops these days can make use of Animate Dead to make some infinite mana and simply win the game. How exciting. But yeah, Animate Dead, it is funny that it's also a win con in addition to being a plain old reanimation effect. Yep. I can't imagine a future in which we're not still jamming Animate Dead. Sorry, not Reanimate Dead. A future when we're not playing Animate Dead. So it's great. It's great to have it here in ABUR.
Awesome. Next one is part of a 2-cycle boon, meaning that it was 2 colors and it directly hosed the opposite or the enemy color of its particular, but I guess its enemy color. And that is Red Elemental Blast. So Red Elemental Blast is an interesting one because Red Elemental Blast usually is associated with Pyroblast as well. And they each do their own thing. This is part of a cycle of 2, the other one being Blue Elemental Blast. So in ABUR, they had big cycles and they had mini cycles. So they actually had cycles from the very beginning, and there were a number of those. And Blue Blast and Red Blast were part of a 2-card cycle, one that directly hosed the other. So this one is the one where he says choose one, and that's the one where you have to choose the mode. It's counter target blue spell or destroy target blue permanent. Blue is very ubiquitous in this format. And so Red having access to unconditional counter any blue spell is actually really, really powerful. So powerful, in fact, that blue decks run it. Blue decks with red in them still run Red Blast and then its associated Pyroblast that comes later. The difference between those two is that this one is modal and the other is conditional, meaning that you can target with Pyroblast something that isn't blue, and only on resolution will it actually say, well, counter it or destroy it if it's blue, versus this one, it has to be blue. Small differences, but they have their different utilities. But Red Blast, 1 red, destroy any blue permanent, kill your Consecrated Sphinx, kill your Thrasios, or counter any blue spell. It doesn't matter what it is. Very powerful card. It was part of a mini cycle in ABUR.
Yep. Red Elemental Blast is a fascinating Magic the Gathering card because it's just like one of those red cards that kind of just doesn't do things that red cards do anymore. It's effectively a counter spell, since it just can counter a blue spell, and pretty much any other counter spell we're playing is going to be blue. It can remove a lot of impactful blue permanents. Red Elemental Blast blowing up Rhystic Studies, or not fishes as much, but Rhystic Studies is a very common line of play. So it's great to have this fairly surprisingly flexible spell available to all of our red decks. I feel like I've been saying this a lot, but I would be surprised when we get to a day where red decks are not finding the room for Red Elemental Blast anymore. Maybe 5-color decks don't play Red Elemental Blast, but I don't know.
I'm pretty sure they do, but yeah, you're right. Maybe we just get such high card quality in the density, and we've become so optimized that it just. I've definitely seen decks where it doesn't run both.
Yeah, for sure.
Also, but one little fun fact about Alpha: this was misprinted as an instant when it should have been
instead of
an
interrupt.
Yep.
Yeah.
So because it's supposed to be a counter spell, and it was actually misprinted as an instant in Alpha, and it was fixed in Beta. It was one of the things they fixed.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. Moving on from Red Elemental Blast. Speaking of cards that were not correct in Alpha, but were corrected later on, and very powerful cards that were not removed from Revised, it is the entire dual land cycle. I don't know if they're beyond like the obvious one, like maybe Soul Ring. I don't know if there's any cards that we could talk about here today that are more ubiquitous in CEDH than the dual lands. They make your mana easy. Together with the fetches, dual lands just kind of make a lot of 3, 4, 5 color mana easy, because it's just go and get this card, put it into play, boom, it gives you 2 colors of mana. What do you want? In a 5-color deck, if you have a fetch, which I'm sure we'll talk about a lot when we get to Odyssey.
Onslaught.
Yeah, sorry, Onslaught, the other O starting name. Onslaught, the Onslaught fetches.
2 blocks next to each other. They were right next to each other.
Cut this. It's embarrassing. Cut this.
Exactly. Cut his embarrassing moment.
But you have a dual land, you could just go and get all of your colors of mana thanks to the dual lands. No matter what fetch you got, it'll get you any color of dual land. And obviously the kind of problem that we run into with the dual lands these days is that since they are so desirable, they're like by far the second most expensive cards that we're talking about. We haven't reached the most expensive one yet, but they're very expensive. Even the cheaper ones will still run you a beat up one of the cheapest one will still run you like $150 these days
or more.
Or more. And it'll just go all the way up. Like I've been keeping tabs on a revised Volcanic Island, because the Volcanic Island is one that I would like to own. And even a really beat up one will run you 500 plus these days. So, and they're not coming down either. So the dual lands, they're expensive. They're the cards that give you like the last nth of optimization to your 3, 4, 5 color decks. We actually talked about this in a previous episode of the Playing with Power podcast, where we were talking about like how you can get the most bang for your buck if you're buying cards with the intention of upgrading your CEDH collection. And we kind of were like, dual lands, you don't need them. Don't spend $500 on a volcanic island when you could buy 10 other cards on this list that we talked about today instead. But when you're in the market for dual lands, there's kind of no better cards to just smooth out your mana base, that last nth percent. And as a result, they will simply always be played. They always have been played in CEDH. They've been played in every format where you can play them because they're the best lands that have ever been printed. You could talk about dual lands all day long. They're just all so good.
Best lands ever printed. I have nothing else to add. Yeah, you're absolutely right. 100%.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. Best lands. All right. So let's dive into the next one here. And that is Wheel of Fortune. So Wheel of Fortune is a reserve list card, which we will talk about when actually the reserve list comes around later on in the series. But Wheel of Fortune is 3 for a sorcery that says discard your hand, draw 7 cards. Everyone does it. So they didn't quite know what they were doing back then, but they were basically saying, hey, let's take this really cool idea, this concept, and have everyone wield a hand. And the fact that it's so cheap, and they didn't really know how powerful an effect that was, is why it was so cheap. I'm from a casting cost perspective, and it was very, very broken. Dump out your hand, refill it for 3, dump it out again. It was unbelievably powerful. It's banned in most formats that it would otherwise see eternal play. And it's just so good. And it's just so flavorful too. Wheel of Fortune as a name, and the art on it is really great. But we see Wheel of Fortune in many red decks to this day, because especially if you're in low color red decks that doesn't have a whole lot of card draw, Wheel of Fortune and it's like imitators, if you will, of things like Wheel of Misfortune. It's so important to those types of decks because you need to be able to refill your hand easily. And the idea of disrupting hands and stuff like that, especially turn 1 wheels, just kill everyone's mulligans, just destroy them, and they just can knock people out of the game entirely. Fantastic card.
Yeah. Wheel of Fortune, it's a lot of high risk, high reward as far as CDH cards go, and for that reason, a lot of people are a little bit more down on wheels than they might have been. People have tried to like statistically prove using CDH content that wheels are bad or good or all that kind of stuff. And a lot of people just refuse to run them because even though the upside is there, boy, does the downside feel bad of you wheeling your opponents into the perfect stuff. But wheels are pretty good. And Wheel of Fortune is one of 2 wheels that just happen to be present at the very beginning of the game. It's just something that's always been here. Heck, there were even wheels at the beginning of Pokemon. Wizards liked wheels so much that they broke Pokemon in half with a wheel. Good old Professor Oak. But Wheel of Fortune, it's great. Dump all your good cards out of your opening hand, wheel away the chaff left, and look at another 7 and hope that your opponents didn't do as well as you did. Won't be playing Wheel of Fortune. People who like Wheel of Fortune will continue to be playing Wheel of Fortune. And, it just so happens to fuel your breach lines too.
Yep.
So win-win. Speaking of a card that is very similar to Wheel of Fortune in that the people who like it will keep playing it, and the people who don't like it won't keep playing it, even though they like it or not. It is by far the most expensive card on this list. It's the only part of the Power 9 that is legal in our wonderful format of EDH, and that is Time Twister. It's kind of like Wheel of Fortune, a blue and 2 colorless sorcery. Everybody shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library, and then everybody draws 7 cards. It's so close to Wheel of Fortune, but you kind of like reset parts of the game instead. Rather than dumping your whole hand into your graveyard and drawing 7, everybody gets to get all their graveyard back into their library and draw 7 more cards. It's very analogous to Wheel of Fortune, but it's also quite different at the same time. Because Time Twister, it can remove all of those. It can remove all of those pesky cards from your opponent's graveyards. It doesn't fuel your own breach. In fact, it can set you back on kind of a plucky start to a breach line because you won't have much of a graveyard by the time you get around to it. But this card is one of the Power 9 for a reason. This card will run you 4 figures for a reason, where even the most expensive versions of the other cards on this list will, well, they'll run you 4 figures. Alpha Duels will run you 4 figures. Don't worry about it. But a cheapest Time Twister will run you $6,000 or whatever these days, when none of the other cards come close, and there's a reason for that. Time Twister is just simply one of the most powerful Magic the Gathering cards ever printed. It's crazy to me that we're allowed to play it, and it's crazy to me that people choose not to play it in their decks.
Time Twister was when the Commander format was first created, if you will, from Sheldon Menery and the members of the rules committee. They said, okay, well, what card should we kind of have on this ban list for this thing, since this is becoming a thing? And they said, well, we don't want the Power 9 on there. However, what's the worst Power 9 card? We don't want to just be seen as another version of Vintage. So what are we going to do to kind of help differentiate ourselves a little bit from it? And one of the things they did was they said, let's put Time Twister on there. Time Twister's not very powerful. And
it wasn't that expensive either.
It wasn't.
Which was part of what disqualified a lot of the rest of the Power 9.
Yep. What disqualified it was, number one, is ubiquity. It was going to immediately be in every single deck. And number two, it was going to make the format inaccessible. And so they put Time Twister, they left the Power 9 off, and they kept Time Twister in. They said, hey, look, here's a format where you can play things like Soul Ring and Time Twister. Ooh, and they did the ooh at the end too. It was very important. It was very
every
important.
Every single time.
Ooh. Yeah, it's in their press releases. It's everywhere. Ooh. Anyway, so Time Twister then, through the rise of CEDH, became not one of the least expensive cards on the Power 9. Since it's legal in Commander, it has actually surpassed some of the other cards. You can get an Ancestral Recall for less than a Time Twister. And that shows you just kind of how powerful this card was when people actually started to play it. And the reason that people don't play it is because maybe they don't proxy and they just, I don't know, can't afford $5 to $10,000 for a card. How about that? But like, it's so expensive, but it's also
that's crazy.
Yeah, it's also so powerful. It's one of the only Power 9 cards I own and will ever own, because number one, it's legal in Commander. Number two, it's just so unbelievably expensive. And it's a card I could actually play if I wanted to. So that's a nice feeling that I don't buy an Ancestral Recall and it just sits in a case somewhere.
Sits around.
Yeah. I mean, my Time Twister does sit around in a case, but that's besides the point. Yep. But essentially, Time Twister was one of the pillars they wanted to differentiate the format from. And Time Twister is played in CEDH. It's a very good card in CEDH. Breach decks don't play it because they don't want to hose their graveyards, but a lot of other decks still will play it because they absolutely love the idea of refreshing their graveyards and getting a fresh 7. Super powerful card.
Yep, exactly. And that is all the cards that we have to talk about from Alpha, Beta, Unlimited, and Revised. There's other stuff we could definitely mention. Kind of a few really fast, like Winter Orb, Basalt Monolith, Copy Artifact, and so on, that do see play in CEDH. Specific decks have ebbed and flowed over time, but we're not going to get into that today. We've talked enough about Magic the Gathering cards. Did you enjoy this episode? Did you know any of these fun factoids about Alpha, Beta, Unlimited, and Revised? Did you even know that some of these cards that you play every day in your CEDH decks were all the way back from the start of Magic the Gathering history in 1993? Did you even know that they were that old? Let us know. Make sure to give us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast aggregator. You'd be surprised how much it helps. You can also find us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and more. All links are in the episode notes. That wraps it up for this episode of the podcast. Tune in next time when we talk more about our favorite format in our favorite game, Magic the Gathering. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and we will see you next time.